gentlemen, in this final lecture, what I want to do is look at the whole area of natural theology. And I want to look at this both as something that is theologically interesting, but also I think as something that really opens up important apologetic possibilities. And in many ways, natural theology is a very obvious dialogue partner between the natural sciences on the one hand and Christian theology on the other. And the topic of natural theology does interest me quite a lot, and I'm afraid I've published quite a lot on this recently. And there is the latest book I've written on this. And the reason I've actually put the cover on the screen is that we're very close to Norway. And actually I chose a cover title by a Norwegian artist, which I think is rather nice, and there's his name. I'm afraid I can't pronounce it. There we are. Basically, natural theology, I think, is a way of thinking about the Christian faith and the natural sciences, which has lots to offer us. So what I'm going to do is to explore this with you and just open up some possibilities. And again, throughout these lectures, my basic strategy has been to throw ideas at you and say, are these of any use to you? And in many ways, my challenge here is simply to try and resource you to deal more effectively with the kind of questions our culture's asking, with the kind of questions other Christians are asking, and also to give us a deeper vision of what the Christian faith is all about. So let me begin with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. Now, I introduced Chesterton to you earlier, a very well-known British journalist, in many ways the prototype of C.S. Lewis. And I think one of the difficulties is that C.S. Lewis does what G.K. Chesterton tried to do so much better, that very often when you read Chesterton you say he's just a poor version of Lewis. But actually, in his own time, Chesterton was seen as really very important. And he writes these words: "Every true artist feels that he is touching transcendental truths, that his images are shadows of things seen through the veil." Now, I'll leave that on the screen for a while, because it's a lovely quotation, and in effect it's a very good way of transitioning into the whole realm of natural theology. It's this idea that we live in this world, but we have this deep sense that there is a still greater world beyond it. And if we were somehow to grasp that greater world, it would help us to make more sense of our lives within this world. And Chesterton is here really saying that that's what artists feel. It's what they're trying to do, to convey something of what they have seen to us under the limiting conditions of this world. But look at the imagery he's using. His images are shadows of things seen through the veil. And he's using very much the language of the New Testament there, which talks about God's glory being veiled because we cannot cope with it nor its fullness, and also the idea of this world being shadows. Many of you will know that image from Plato's dialogue, The Republic. And it comes from Book 10. And Plato asks us to imagine a situation. He asks us to imagine a cave, a dark underground cave, in which there is a fire burning, and in which there are people who have been there all their lives. In other words, they do not know any other world, and they see the shadows cast on the wall by the flames of the fire. And Plato is really inviting us to consider this question: is our world really a world of shadows, which we think is the only thing, whereas in fact beyond the cave there is this bright, brilliant, beautiful world which you don't know because it lies beyond the cave? And one of the questions that arises from Plato's imagery of the cave is this: how could those people inside the cave get to know of the world beyond the cave? Now, one answer might be that they see things in the cave that suggests there is something beyond the cave. There might be objects in the cave which cannot be explained, so they think there must be something beyond the cave. But of course, the best answer of all is that maybe somebody from that greater world could go into the cave and tell them about it and make it possible for them to go into this new world. So you can see there, the whole idea of natural theology, the idea of incarnation being opened up in very interesting and accessible ways. And in many ways, Chesterton is kind of hinting at this in his language. So that's from the Everlasting Man. So let's begin with a classic English work of natural theology. This is Joseph Addison, who wrote a very famous hymn in the early 18th century, which includes these words: "The unwearied sun from day to day does his Creator's power display, and publishes to every land the work of an almighty hand." It's part of a longer poem that's actually become a very popular hymn in England. But the basic theme is that the beauty, the regularities of the world point us beyond them to God as their creator. And in many ways, one of the cornerstones of natural theology is the Christian doctrine of creation. It's the idea that God is like an artist, someone who creates something that is beautiful, and just like an artist leaves his signature, some way of saying, this is my work. So that in looking at the beauty of the world, we're able to appreciate it for what it is, but also appreciate it because it is a shadow of God himself. And that's the theme I'm going to explore in this lecture. Why am I doing that? Well, here in Scandinavia, I think there is a very important reason for doing this. There are many people in this part of the world who in effect will see respecting nature and loving nature and venerating nature as being very, very important, but will not connect up with Christianity at all. In effect, they have what you and I might loosely call a pagan way of looking at things, which exults in the beauty and the grandeur of nature, and then says, that is it. One of the ways of connecting with this way of thinking is a natural theology, which begins by saying, isn't nature beautiful? But nature is pointing beyond itself. We can appreciate for what it is, but that is basically like reading a letter from someone you love and saying, oh, isn't it nice paper? Look at the beautiful handwriting. And failing to realize what is actually saying and the connection with the author, who is someone that you love. So what I'm going to do in this lecture is begin to explore some issues and see where they take us. Let's begin by asking what actually is the idea of natural theology itself. And what I need to say to you is that this word means many possible things. For some of you, the phrase natural theology means something like this: proving the existence of God on the basis of purely natural processes of reasoning or by an appeal to the natural world. In other words, if you disregard revelation, you use simply natural reasoning processes or an appeal to the natural order. I want to say that those ideas are important, but they are not the only ways of thinking about natural theology. It has also been used, that phrase, to mean something like a Christian way of looking at nature. In other words, almost a theology of nature. It can also mean the fact that there seems to be a resonance between the world we observe and what we would expect on the basis of the Christian tradition. But rather than worry about definitions, I'm going to say let's just work for our purposes this afternoon with the idea of natural theology as this idea that in some way there is a connection between the natural world as God's creation and the nature of God himself. How do we understand that? What can we do with this? Here's a quote from the medieval writer Bonaventure. And many of you will have read Bonaventure, for instance. Spirituality is a very interesting writer. But what he is saying here is that this world points us beyond itself. All the creatures of this sensible, he means physical, world lead the soul of a wise and contemplative person to the eternal God, since they are the shadows, echoes, pictures, vestiges, images, and visible manifestations of their eternal origin. They are put before us for the sake of our knowing God. And many of you will know the great Renaissance tradition of what is sometimes called the two books, the book of Scripture, the book of nature. And each of them points to God, but in different ways. The book of nature gives us an intimation that there is a God, but doesn't help us to find God or tell us what God is like. Whereas the book of Scripture gives us a framework for making sense of nature, including establishing that vital link between nature and God, and amplifying and clarifying the nature of this God and making salvation possible. So there's some very interesting ideas here. So we come then to scientism. Now I've talked about scientism already today. And here's a definition of scientism published in a recent collection of essays in a journal of philosophy dealing with the new atheism. And I think it's a very good definition of scientism. Do you remember I defined scientism very loosely as the view that science is the only way of answering our great questions? Here is this writer's definition of scientism. It is, he writes, a totalizing attitude that regards science as the ultimate standard and arbiter of all interesting questions, or alternatively, that seeks to expand the very definition and scope of science to encompass all aspects of human knowledge and understanding. And what I want to say to you is that this idea is there in our culture. Sure, there are many critics of this idea in your culture as well, but this is an idea that you will need to engage with. And what I want to do briefly in this lecture is to open up ways in which natural theology might be able to do this. So let's begin by picking up on the theme I mentioned in an earlier lecture based on the works of Richard Dawkins. And this is his book, Unweaving the Rainbow. Unweaving the Rainbow. And in that book, Dawkins argues that if you believe in God, then that attenuates your aesthetic vision of nature. Put this another way, if you believe in God, you do not appreciate the beauty, the wonder of nature in the way that an atheist would. Now, I think it's a very, very problematic and difficult argument, and I think actually the evidence is entirely in the other direction. Actually, believing in God enhances your appreciation of nature. But let me open up what Richard Dawkins is saying. How might we appreciate the beauty of nature, and where might that take us? Dawkins begins by making the point that in his view, Christianity gets in the way of grasping the beauty of nature. But those of you who are psychologists will say, well, look, there is a problem here in that beauty, the perception of beauty, is not something that goes through a kind of atheistic or theistic filter. We have to understand this, and then we make a response of admiration of beauty. It's something that happens immediately. It's a matter of perception. You look at something and you say, my goodness, that is beautiful, before you've had time to think, what is it I'm looking at? That's one of the reasons why recent Christian apologetics has focused more on the experience of beauty. In the past, it would be arguments for God's existence or inferring God's existence from the orderedness of nature. Now, you very often say that the beauty of nature needs an explanation, because scientifically it's actually quite difficult to explain why we find nature so beautiful. So it's very interesting how this is opened up. But the point I'm making is that when I and Richard Dawkins look at the same beautiful landscape, I suspect we probably think very similar thoughts, despite the fact that he's an atheist and I'm a Christian. Belief about God just doesn't affect the way in which we intuitively respond to a beautiful landscape, to a beautiful person, or indeed to a breathtaking scene set up in the mountains where you suddenly become aware of the vastness of creation. But there's another level at which this might happen. Dawkins argues that it's not just nature itself that can be beautiful, it's also theoretical representations of nature. Why is it, for example, Paul Dirac asked, that mathematical equations describing the world are often so beautiful and so elegant? And Dawkins argues that in some way religious people have difficulty in dealing with that. But I don't see why. Because in many ways what you are saying is that nature at every level expresses beauty, both in terms of how we see it and how we represent it mathematically. Now many of you will know, if you're a physicist in particular, that the Scottish writer James Clerk Maxwell, who became one of Britain's greatest 19th century physicists, set out a set of equations which in effect demonstrated the identity really of electricity and magnetism. And what is not widely known is that James Clerk Maxwell was a Christian who took the view that God created everything and therefore there had to be a fundamental interconnectedness of things, and therefore saw this demonstration that electricity and magnetism were two sides of the same coin as being an affirmation of the coherence of the world and the coherence of the Christian way of thinking. So I'm not really sure what Dawkins is saying here. But there's a third point, and it's something we really need to emphasize. Christians value the beauty of nature. And one of the reasons they do this is because nature is beautiful. But the other reason is that the beauty of God, as Bonaventure was saying in that earlier slide, points us towards the greater beauty of God. What we see is wonderful. One day we will see something even more beautiful. And what we now see is like a foretaste, an anticipation, a sketch map of that greater beauty which one day we shall see. So I'm puzzled by what Dawkins is saying here. And it seems to me that a natural theology is a very powerful critique of scientism. Because scientism tends to reduce nature simply to formulae, things like that. And it seems to me that very often it robs nature of its beauty. There's a point made by John Keats, an English poet. And this is Keats reflecting on his concerns that somehow science might impoverish the beauty of nature. He's using the word philosophy here to refer to natural philosophy. And his worry is that science will evacuate nature of its beauty and wonder. I will read the words and then explain them and then ask whether Keats is right. Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was once an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings. What's he saying? The word woof there doesn't refer to the noise a dog makes. It actually refers to the way you weave a piece of cloth. In other words, it's about the fabric of the world. What Keats is saying is that science, in effect, because it uses a reductionist method to achieve its results, has to reduce, dilute, or even destroy the beauty of nature to make sense of it. And that's why he uses this language about the rainbow. He's saying that the awe and the beauty of the rainbow is damaged by scientific interpretation. And he talks about a dull catalogue of common things. In other words, it's reduced to the ordinary. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings. In other words, something that was made to make us want to soar upwards loses its ability to do so. Now, I can see Keats's points, but I do think he overstates here. Of course, science can rob nature of its beauty, in the sense that it offers an explanation of why we find something to be beautiful. But it does not stop us as experiencing something as beautiful. So my feeling is that Keats here is exaggerating, even though I am very sympathetic to some of the things that he is saying. This is Reinhold Niebuhr talking about what I think is really interesting, which is in effect a parallel between scientism and fundamentalism. And some of you will find this puzzling, but actually I think there is something in this. Fundamentalists have at least one characteristic in common with most scientists. Neither can understand that poetic and religious imagination has a way of arriving at truth by giving a clue to the total meaning of things without being in any sense an analytic description of detailed facts. Now I'm going to leave that on the screen for you to read, because actually it's a very interesting comment. And it goes back to a question that was raised earlier this morning, which basically is, how do you evaluate a way of looking at things? Do you try and have a checklist of rationality so you can begin to work out whether something is credible or not? And what Reinhold Niebuhr is saying here, long before Richard Dawkins began to write in this field, is that what he calls poetic and religious imagination has a way of, look at this language, arriving at truth by giving a clue to the total meaning of things. And what Niebuhr is getting at is those moments where, perhaps briefly, we feel that a light has been turned on and we see something, or perhaps a curtain has been drawn aside and we see something very, very briefly, but it's there and we can see that bigger picture and it stays with us. And in many ways, that's what natural theology is doing. It's in saying to us, there is this natural world around us. We're part of it. But we begin to realize that it is disclosing and hinting something that is greater, because God has created this and us, and the created world is studded with clues and signs of the presence and love and power of God. You might think, for example, of Psalm 19, verse 1. The heavens declare the glory of the Lord. It's a very powerful text. I think it raises in our minds this question of being able to look at the beauty of nature and then being able to make a connection between that and God himself. In the Old Testament, as I'm sure you know, there's always a tension here between looking at the beauty of nature to see God. Think, for example, of the book of Job, particularly the last 3 chapters, and looking at the actions of God, what God has done in history. Israel, on the whole, tend to remember what God did in history, the Exodus and so on, rather than the beauty of nature. But today, that theme of the beauty of nature, I think, is very important for most of us. This is the American writer Jonathan Edwards, writing in the 18th century, and Edwards here is making this connection between the beauty of nature and its creator. And he's asking us to imagine accompanying him as he walked along the Raritan Valley. So try and imagine a beautiful wooded river valley here in Denmark. And listen to Edwards' thoughts and ask whether you've ever thought similar thoughts as these. Here's what he says. When we are delighted with flowering meadows and gentle breezes of wind, we may consider that we see only the emanations of the sweet benevolence of Jesus Christ. When we behold the fragrant rose and lily, we see his love and purity. So the green trees and fields are shadows of his infinite beauty and loveliness. Why shadows? Because they're slightly dark and they don't fully disclose the light and the colour of God's beautiful creation. What Edwards is doing here is mapping out a way of holding together those who believe in Christianity and those who love the beauty of nature. And so one of the things I want to emphasize is that there are possibilities here for you to think about how you connect Christianity with the relatively large number of people here in Scandinavia who do appreciate the beauty of nature, but see Christianity as in effect having nothing to do with that whatsoever. And so the thought I am thinking, and the thoughts I am encouraging you to think, are, is there any way in which the Christian doctrine of creation, or the kind of natural theology which I'm sketching out so briefly in this lecture, might help you engage in dialogue with these people? I think there's a lot that you can do, and in many ways the core question you need to discuss is, given that you are agreed on the beauty of nature, is that where the conversation stops, or might there be a way of signposting this as leading on to the greater beauty of God? And that quote I gave you from G.K. Chesterton about every artist feeling they're reaching through to touch the transcendent, there are shadows, there are veils, but nevertheless there's something really there. That could be a very good way of making that connection. Now, in recent years, there's been a lot of interest in what's called the psychology of awe. And this is not the kind of reduction stuff that tries to explain this away. It's very much asking what is characteristic of this sense of awe that so many people experience in the presence of natural vastness. And one of the answers is that the specific sense of awe arises because psychologically we find it virtually impossible to get our minds around the immensity of a natural vista, for example, a mountainous landscape. And therefore we experience a sense of awe because we realize we cannot fully take this in. Now, I think this is very interesting, and it does open up some very interesting questions. But what I want to point out is it also helps us understand what Christian worship is all about. Because in many ways what Christian worship is about realizing that we've come together in the presence of something that is awesome. Not in the kind of trivial American sense of that word, but rather in a sense of something that is so astonishing that we struggle to take it in fully. Now, in theology, we use the word mystery. And a mystery does not mean an irrationality. A mysterion, to use the Greek word, is much more about something that is so immense that we simply cannot get our heads around it. Now, Richard Dawkins and I disagree on lots of things, and I think you'll have gathered. But there's one passage in one of his books where he talks about the idea of mystery. And he makes this point. Isn't it ridiculous to assume that the minds of people like us, who in his view have evolved to deal with medium-sized objects moving at medium-sized speeds in medium-sized landscapes, can actually cope with the mystery of our universe? In other words, he's saying that we struggle to take in the immensity of our universe. And I think that's one of the things that's there in Christian worship. It's this realization we've come into the presence of something and someone which is so immense that it evokes a sense of wonder and awe. Remember Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah comes into the presence of God in the temple and is overwhelmed by the gloriousness and the grandeur and the majesty of God. What I want you to note is the response. What is Isaiah's response in Isaiah chapter 6? Initially, he is so overwhelmed, he gets down on his knees because he realizes his sinfulness. I am a sinful man. Then God deals with the sin. And look at the second article. God says, who shall we send? And Isaiah is so animated and inspired by this vision. He says, here am I, send me. Now I think that is something very important. I remember talking to some atheists in a meeting in London some years ago, and just out of interest I asked them what they were doing on Sundays. I explained I was leading some worship services and how worship was really very exciting because it made us realize how we were in the presence of something bigger than us, and that worship in effect was recognition of our smallness in the presence of a living and loving God. And they said, well, we are going to meet, 6 or 7 of us, and we're going to have some sandwiches and tea, and we're going to watch a Richard Dawkins video. And I have to say, and I'm sure you'll think I'm being a very harsh person here, I thought, how sad, that they are simply watching another human being, and not something that would really excite and animate them. Because worship, I think, is about this realization of the wondering glory of God, which excites us and animates us. And this is the point I think I need to make to the theologians present. Theology does its job best when it makes us want to worship God. I think there's always this danger that we simply think of theology in terms of getting ideas right. But actually, when theology is done properly, it makes us want to get down on our knees and worship God, because we grasp something of the glorious vision of God. We see something of the big picture, which is so important to our lives, to our thought, and to worship. So theology, I think, has much to say to us in this context. Now, I'm going to stop lecturing quite shortly because I do want us to give plenty of time for questions. But let me end, if I may, with a quote from Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, towards the end of his life, was asked if he would like to write a few lines about something that he had thought late in life as a result of all his scientific discoveries and his own theological reflections. And he wrote these words. What I'm going to do, if I may, is read them to you and just reflect on them. They say a lot about natural theology, but I think they also give us clues about how we might do apologetics. Many of you will know this quote, but it's still a wonderful thing to read. I seem to have been only like a small boy, playing on the seashore, diverting myself in now and then finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than the ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me. And in many ways, Newton was saying, look, I've been observing the planets, I've seen something of what's going on there, but there is this massive ocean which is unexplored, and it's still there. Why is this helpful to us? Well, it does help us to see something of how we might begin to engage with people who love nature, who in effect have found smooth pebbles or pretty shells. And we share with them in admiring their beauty, but we also want to ask the deeper question: what do they tell us? What is the bigger picture of what they are part? And that, I think, is a very important question. But perhaps more importantly, Newton here is saying something, not simply about science, but maybe also about our faith. That in effect, very often we are so glad we can understand anything that we embrace this, whereas very often there is simply so much more to try and take in that we resist trying to engage it. One of the reasons why Christians believe in the doctrine of the Trinity is because it safeguards the mystery of God. It stops us from reducing God to the intellectually manageable. It safeguards this awe-inspiring, glorious and majestic God who is the object of worship above all and comprehension secondarily. And I think it is something very important, safeguarding that mystery, so we don't end up rationalizing God and turning God into some kind of object. But standing back and bringing these lectures to an end, I think the main thing I've wanted to say in all of these 4 lectures is this. The Christian faith does make a lot of sense. The Christian faith, in my view, is very exciting. When I discovered it, I think I really began a voyage of discovery in which I found myself opened up by this growing realization of the wonderful comprehensiveness of the Christian vision. And I think I grew as a person as I explored my faith. And it made me much more equipped to deal with the kind of questions our culture is asking. And so I suppose what I'm really saying in all these lectures is this. We really need to deepen our own understanding of our faith. It's good for us. Sometimes I think we skate the surface of our faith, but we need to go deep. It's good for our own faith. Helps us to really appreciate how rich it is. But also I think makes it much more possible and effective for us to engage our culture and give responses to what our culture is asking. And the point I need to emphasize is this. One of the things that brought me to faith was hearing intelligent Christians talking about their faith. And I didn't yet know that they were right, but I began to realize very quickly that these were not the deluded fools that my atheist friends said they were. And so I began to listen. I think we need to make sure we're able to explain our faith to our culture using languages and images and stories which are able to engage them, speaking their language and trying to understand where they're coming from. Because all of us can be the gateway to faith for people who are asking these deep questions. We just need to be able to help them to see that there is so much more to the Christian faith than what they know, and help them to discover it in all its richness. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening.